So good evening, everybody. My name is Lisa McIntosh and I am the Interim University Librarian here at the University of Sydney. And it's my pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies tonight. So just in terms of housekeeping, we've got exits and emergency exits up the top and also like an airline out the side. Bathrooms are at the top of the stairs, just the side for on both sides. And if you could all please ensure that your phones are turned to silent. Okay. So thank you for coming, and I'm just so glad it's not raining. I'm so glad that Richard arrived and he's brought beautiful weather with him this week. So this year we celebrate the university's 175th anniversary, a milestone that reflects our institution's enduring commitment to knowledge, discovery and scholarship. Since its founding, the library has been an integral part of the university's identity. One of the first and earliest decisions the Senate made was the purchase of the first library books, 52 books acquired for £100. And we still have that very first book. Today, our library has grown immensely, spanning 14 locations across all the campuses and housing 4.6 million books that continue to inspire curiosity and scholarly inquiry. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that we are on today. This is Gadigal country. I acknowledge the Gadi, the people of this place, and their elders past and present. I also acknowledge and express deep gratitude for their continued connection and care of country. We know this land was at the forefront of first contact, and we know this land belongs to the oldest living continuing culture on earth. We honour the strength, achievements and enduring cultural richness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities whose stories are about survival and leadership, innovation and excellence. As we mark 175 years of the university, we acknowledge that this place has always been a place of learning and knowledge exchange for over 60,000 years. Wisdom has been passed down here through many generations. In recognising this milestone for the institution, it is important to acknowledge the profound impact of the colonial legacy on the peoples of this place and the land itself. Wisdom has been passed down here through many generations. As we look forward to the next 175 years, we do so with a commitment to truth-telling, respect and a future led by emerging leaders, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who live, work, learn and thrive here. So this evening, the library is particularly proud to welcome our keynote speaker, Richard Ovenden. Richard is Bodley's librarian and the Helen Hamlin Director of University Libraries at the University of Oxford. He also holds the overarching post of the Head of Gardens, Libraries and Museums, for which he has strategic oversight at Oxford. Richard was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2019 and was made an Honorary Doctor of Letters by Durham University in 2024. Richard's also recently been awarded honorary fellowships of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Literature. Richard has written extensively on professional concerns of library and information management, on the history of photography, and he has written a history of the deliberate destruction of knowledge, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack. And that history is the basis of his presentation tonight, although world events since it was published in 2020 provide further evidence to support his thesis. After we hear from our distinguished international speaker, Richard will be joined in conversation by Associate Professor Sophie G. Sophie is a writer, researcher and educator with 25 years' experience at Harvard and Princeton universities. An alum of Sydney, Sophie was appointed the inaugural Vice-Chancellor Fellow at the University of Sydney in 2024, and that continues in 2025. Her role advises the Vice-Chancellor on how to broaden and deepen public conversations around the value and identity and future of universities in a contemporary world and the value of humanities in universities and in public life. Together with Jonty Claypool, Sophie hosts Australia's #1 literary podcast, The Secret Life of Books. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge Dr. Steve Andersen, OMA, an alumnus of the University of Sydney, who through a generous philanthropic gift has supported the opportunity for Richard to join us here in Sydney. This special gift is in recognition of the late Mrs. Mary Andersen, also a Sydney alumna, who was a passionate librarian and dedicated to the role of libraries in education for the betterment of society. We're so delighted you could join us this evening, Steve, and thank you for your support. But first, please join me in warmly welcoming Richard Ovenden.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to all of you for coming and listening to me this evening, and also joining us in the conversation that Sophie and I are about to have. But before we go into conversational mode, I've got a short presentation for you this evening, really in three parts. I'm going to give you some background, the long history of the deliberate destruction of knowledge, talking about how libraries and archives in particular have been the subject of attack. But at the same time, I'm going to talk about how librarians and archivists in particular have responded to those attacks and have sought to find ways, at times through their own risking their own personal lives to enable the preservation of knowledge. The second part is really bringing that story up to date. What is happening at the moment? And I've got a few choice examples for you. And then I'm going to finish by talking about my own sense of what the value of libraries and archives are in contemporary society. What contribution do they make to our world? But I'm going to kind of frame my talk this evening with this quote from Derrida. And in particular, I think, although it was written in the last century, it speaks very much to the moment in which we're living today, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the triggers for me writing this book was a visit I made to Berlin in 2018. The Bodley has a collaboration with the State Library of Berlin, and I was early for a meeting there at their building right in the heart of Berlin on Unter den Linden. And as I was walking around just killing time, I stumbled upon the site where the event that's on the screen behind me took place on the 10th of May 1933. And today there's a very moving plaque which commemorates this event, where, as you can see, piles of books that had been taken forcibly from neighbouring libraries, from synagogues, and from an Institute for Human Sexuality were piled up, petrol was poured over them, and the individuals who'd undertaken that act, they were students, chanted about how they were eliminating un-German ideas from the world. That event was filmed, it was very much orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, and similar events took place in other German cities at the time. And as I was thinking about that act and the very moving, it's a kind of an empty library that is the memorial to it, I thought, my mum was alive when this happened. She's still with us now, she's 96. But she was alive. This didn't actually happen long ago. And you think of it as like these black and white photographs that you find in many textbooks, many history books. But it happened within living memory. And that's something which really struck me, that the way that knowledge is targeted, the way that its destruction serves political, ideological, religious domination is something that we need to focus on today because it's happening all around us. And libraries and archives are institutions in society that help us defend against those attacks. So my book tells this very long story. It goes back to the first libraries and archives that we know of in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, And in the image here, you can see what remains of the Library of Ashurbanipal, formed in the 7th century before the Christian era. In many ways, this was the royal library of the Assyrian kingdom, based in Ashurbanipal's palace in the ancient city of Nineveh, near what is now Mosul in Iraq. And that library, scholars now argue, is one of the first to have been attempted to gather together the whole of human knowledge as it was understood at the time by those peoples. And it's an extraordinary collection of texts, many of which are about the prediction of the future. They're divination, astronomy, astrology. How do you know when is the optimal time to have a child or to fight your enemies or plant a crop? Well, you use these texts. So those texts have a power. But what we also know through the scholarship that's gone on since they were rediscovered in the middle of the 19th century is that Ashurbanipal formed his library by targeting texts in the libraries of his neighbors and enemies. And he sent agents to take by force texts from libraries in Babylonia, for example. And the idea there is that by depriving your enemies of knowledge that helped them predict the future, you made them weaker, but you made yourself stronger. And we'll come back onto that theme later on in my talk. And you can just see the archaeologist or explorer, adventurer, Austin Henry Layard, who rediscovered the library of Ashurbanipal in the ruins, the mound, the great mound that covered the ancient city, the great palace of Nineveh. And here is John Martin's fabulous mezzotint that depicted the fall of Nineveh. Of course, the presence of those clay tablets in the British Museum in London could be the topic of an entirely other talk. I'd like to move on now to the greatest library of the ancient world, or at least the library that the ancients regarded as the greatest library, the Library of Alexandria. And if any of you, like me, grew up watching Carl Sagan's program Cosmos, I direct you to the first episode, where he said, if I could have a time machine and go back in time, I would go back to the Great Library of Alexandria the day before the fire that destroyed it. And I would save all of this knowledge, these papyrus scrolls, for the sake of human civilization. And in fact, the book on your screen is one of the great treasures of the Bodleian. It's a 9th century manuscript. It's the earliest surviving text of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, one of the foundational texts of modern mathematics. And Euclid actually wrote that in the Great Library of Alexandria. But what contemporary scholars now understand is that there was no single event that destroyed this great library, as depicted in this Victorian engraving. What actually happened was a long, slow period of decline. The library was founded as a kind of symbol, an object of royal prestige and patronage. They wanted the best librarians, the best scholars to come and run the library. They wanted multiple scribes to copy texts from other collections to build up this great storehouse of knowledge. And they built a community of scholars next to the library that would, devour the texts and create new knowledge. Euclid was one of them. But over the centuries, it stopped being that object of great prestige and power and funding. And it declined to the point where, by the 4th century of the Christian era, it had gone. It had disappeared. And there began to be debates among ancient writers. What happened to it? Where was it? What had gone on? And the message for me from the Great Library of Alexandria today is about funding. It's about funding libraries. It's about funding the preservation of knowledge. And if we don't take care of these institutions, like the Great Library of Alexandria, they will disappear into the dust. I'm going to move us forward in time now to the middle of the 16th century, and this time to England. I took this photograph in the west of England on the site of the library of the Benedictine Abbey of Glastonbury, one of the greatest religious houses in England in the Middle Ages. Had a great library. We have a library catalogue from the 13th century. We don't know exactly how many books there were on the eve of the Reformation, but it was at least, my guess is at least 2,000. And the abbey was very rich and powerful. To give you a sense, its church was bigger than Canterbury cathedrals. But what's left of it now is just ruins. And of those at least 2,000 books, we only today know of 60 that came from this great library. And much of what we know of its texts come from an archive that we also happen to have in the Bodleian of an antiquary, a historian called John Leland, who was employed by Henry VIII to search the libraries of the religious houses of England in the 1530s and choose from those books that would help the king argue in favour of his divorce from Catherine of Aragon to marry the beautiful young courtier Anne Boleyn, and then later to divorce England itself from papal authority, to establish himself at the head of the Church of England. And you can see Leland has written this list of books that he consulted in the library of Glastonbury Abbey, and at the bottom he writes Grammatica Uticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And that's the book on the left, which is an assembly of texts compiled by St Dunstan, who was both abbot of Glastonbury Abbey and the abbot of Canterbury. Arguably, this is the earliest self-portrait in English art. You can see St Dunstan kneeling at the foot of Christ there. But those books were destroyed. The books that didn't survive, a few of them were protected by monks fleeing the dissolution in 1539, and they entered the hands of collectors and recusant Catholics, and then ended up, those few, in some of the great libraries like the Bodleian. But what happened to the rest of them was that they were torn up as waste. They were sold, pages were torn out of them and sold to butter makers to wrap butter in, to pie makers to line pie dishes. And the same fate happened in Oxford to the library of the university. This is a picture of the medieval library room that still survives today. But its contents in 1549 and 1550 were destroyed. And many of the pages from those books, again, were torn out and sold to bookbinders to strengthen the bindings of the new technology of print. And at the time, there was a phrase that in Oxford, books were dog cheap and whole libraries could be had for an inconsiderable nothing. But it came, so Oxford's great library, its medieval library, was destroyed, but there's a moment of regeneration, of renewal, of preservation. And that's the point that I want to make alongside the point about the destruction of knowledge, is that each time this happens, there is this human impulse to preserve knowledge and to protect it. And this came to Sir Thomas Bodley. There's this wonderful miniature we have by his childhood friend, Nicholas Hilliard. And he re-established the library using his own money, but also his own energy and his network, with the focus on preservation. So the founding statutes, the actual building, these are kind of protective cupboards for the most precious books, were built into his institution. And that kind of sense of the importance of preservation entered the library's kind of DNA. And there's one kind of telling episode which features John Milton, who was a great friend, the poet, with my predecessor, the second librarian. I'm the 25th. And that's John Rouse, my predecessor, in the middle. And Milton presented a special volume of his own poems to the library, including a handwritten poem in praise of the institution. But then, of course, John Milton was one of the signatories of the death warrant of Charles I, and on the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, he and the other regicides, as they were known, were pursued by the king, Charles II, and hunted down. And in fact, in the 1660s and the 1670s, there were two occasions when the books of the regicides, like Milton and Richard Baxter, were ordered to be burned. And they were ordered in Oxford to be burned in the quadrangle of the Bodleian Library. But my predecessor, the fifth librarian, that's Thomas Hyde, the guy in the far corner, he hid that special copy of Milton's poems that the poet had presented. And he even erased it from the catalogue so it wouldn't be given up to that bonfire in his front yard, as it were. And he must have risked quite a bit to do that. I'm going to quickly fast forward us now to the 18th century, to an episode that I was certainly not taught as an English schoolboy studying history, and that is the invasion of Washington, D.C. by British forces in 1812, led by this man and this fabulous mezzotint, Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn. And I particularly want you to focus on the scenes in the back of this mezzotint, which is the burning of Washington. And in fact, we have an eyewitness account of it, written actually by an Oxford alum called George Gleig, who wrote that he'd never seen a scene more sublime than the burning of the city. But even he admitted that a noble library, several printing offices, and all the National Archives were committed to the flames, which might better have been spared. And in fact, we also have a contemporary watercolour of the Capitol building, which housed the Library of Congress and the National Archives. And you can see the smoke stains from the windows after the fire, which was deliberately set by George Gleig's fellow troops. The Capitol building, which housed the two houses and the bureaucrats who ran the administration of Congress and the National Library, was the only stone-built building in Washington at the time. So this was a very deliberate, very symbolic act. And news of it reached Thomas Jefferson, of course, one of the architects of the American Constitution, one of the first presidents, who had retired to his estate at Monticello. And he wrote, having heard about the destruction of the library, a kind of a letter outraged of Monticello to a Washington newspaper, saying that this was an act of barbarism by the British, and that, what's more, it invoked, he felt, what had happened to the Library of Alexandria, which, of course, we now know was a myth. But he, in fact, whoops, going the wrong way. His offer was to Congress to replace the lost books with his own private library. And so again, there's that impulse to renew, to replace. And there was a very interesting debate in Congress whether whether money should be funded to rebuild the library, which indeed it did. And of course, the Library of Congress is the largest and still the best funded library on the planet. I'd like us to move forward now to the middle of the 20th century, to World War II and to the Holocaust, particularly in Eastern Europe, and to take us to the city of Vilnius, or Vilna as it was known at the time, in Lithuania, a city famous for its learned rabbis, famous for its Jewish community, and for libraries and archives in the city that were focused on supporting that community. The Strashun Library on the eve of World War II had a thriving reading room, a learned librarian, and there was another institution in the city called YIVO, and YIVO was an archival institution that was very, very interesting at the time because it tried to preserve and document the lives of everyday, ordinary Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly that transacted in the Yiddish language. And they collected diaries, they collected theatre posters, music hall material, even medical case notes. And then in 1941, Operation Barbarossa unleashed the Blitzkrieg on Central and Eastern Europe, and behind the stormtroopers came a kind of cultural stormtrooper. And these were organised by the man on the left of that screen, Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of the architects of anti-Semitism. And the man on the right was his librarian, Johannes Poole, who ran an operational group that, when the Germans had captured cities, they formed ghettos and moved Jewish people into the ghettos. And what Johannes Poole did was to organise, find librarians and archivists in the ghetto and scholars, and to force them out at gunpoint to search through the captured libraries to send some of the books back to an institute that Alfred Rosenberg had founded in Frankfurt, a kind of perverted research institute called the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. And you can see here actually photographs of those Jewish librarians and archivists sorting through their own collections, some of them to go back to the Frankfurt Institute and some of them to be sent, the bulk of them, to be sent to paper mills for destruction. And the Nazi guards called this group of people the Paper Brigade. And that name they started to call themselves that. But actually what they did was to try to smuggle out back into the ghetto each day pages and documents that they felt needed to be preserved. They wanted to keep a witness to their own civilization, their own community. And they risked their lives every time that they did that, every day, hiding it in their clothes, persuading German guards they needed the paper to light the ovens in the kitchens, even smuggling furniture for the schools. And in the tubular metal frames, they secreted these documents. Unbeknownst to the Paper Brigade in Vilnius, similar things were happening in other cities of occupied Europe. So this is almost certainly a reconstructed scene from Warsaw, where a group called Oyneg Szabes, led by an extraordinary man called Emanuel Ringelblum, had sought in the Warsaw ghetto documents which they wanted to bear witness to the life in the Warsaw ghetto itself. And they hid them in metal canisters and milk cartons and buried them in the ghetto in the hope that they knew that they would not survive, but they hoped that these documents would. And indeed, 2 of the 3 troves were found in the late 1940s and 1950s, and they can be consulted in Warsaw today. Now, the YIVO Institute had been dismantled, its books dispersed by the activities of the Nazis controlling this group called the Paper Brigade. But in 1945, the Rosenberg's Institute at Frankfurt was captured by American troops. And they discovered hundreds of thousands of books and documents. And these had been sent by Johannes Poole's operational group. And they then tried to return them to their rightful owners. And so what you're seeing here is a small group, a small office in New York that the YIVO Institute had established in 1940, and they suddenly got receipt of hundreds of packing cases full of books and documents. And these are now well looked after in New York. Let's just go back to the other part of the collection. These are the things that were hidden in the ruins of the Vilna ghetto by the Paper Brigade. And these were recovered by the small number of Jews who had escaped the liquidation of the ghetto in 1944, and they were able to recover these documents that have miraculously been protected and preserved. And they re-established the YIVO Institute, only to find a few years later that the communists decided that these books were anti-communist and that they should be taken to the paper mills for pulping. And this time it's a Lithuanian librarian, here he is, Antanas Ulpis, who found out that this was happening, drove to the paper mills and turned the trucks around and hid the documents in a branch of the National Library, even hiding some of them because it was a former church, in the organ pipes. they remained a secret until 1989. In 1992, the National University Library of Bosnia in Sarajevo was deliberately targeted by Serbian militia with incendiary devices. No other buildings were shelled on this day. They wanted to eradicate the knowledge of the community in Bosnia, particularly because the library held Jewish, Arabic, or Muslim and Christian Western texts. So this idea of a kind of a community they wanted to eradicate it. And librarians and firefighters tried to rescue documents, but one of them, Ada Butarovic, was murdered by Serb snipers on that day. So these are just a few examples from this long history of the deliberate destruction of knowledge, but also of this urge to preserve, and this kind of the examples of librarians and archivists through history have risked their own lives to ensure that knowledge can pass from one generation to the next. I'd like briefly to talk about what has happened since I first published Burning the Books in 2020. And some of it I've been asked to write up. So in 2021, the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan involved the destruction, the deliberate targeting of libraries, particularly very small libraries that have been established for the education of women and young girls. In Ukraine, of course, libraries have been deliberately targeted by occupying Russian troops, with books in Ukrainian or about Ukrainian history being taken out of those libraries and destroyed, burned in the street. And in America, at the moment, there is an epidemic of book banning, so much so that it's not just banning books that is happening in many American states at the moment, but actual book burning. This is a group of Republicans, including one of the senators, who are using flamethrowers to destroy books that they regard as un-American. Many of them about going back to the Institute of Human Sexuality, its library being targeted in 1939. Many of these books are about what we would call LGBTQ plus issues today. But some of them are surprising, like the works of Margaret Atwood, who is now currently banned in every library in the state of Utah. And she wrote this wonderful article in The Atlantic saying, you know, bring it on. My books have never sold so well when they're banned. And when America sneezes, Britain often catches cold. So we have, a year ago, a public library in Liverpool that targeted services for immigrant communities there was burned down. But again, a user of the library, an ordinary member of the public, started a GoFundMe and very quickly raised £300,000 for its renewal. And what is happening in America, again, is very dark at the moment, I'm afraid. The National Archivist, Colleen Shogan, was sacked in February. And not only that, but the entire committee that controls the classification of public records in America were also sacked. The National Librarian, the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, was sacked in April. And then we have this group of individuals, what my colleague in Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, calls the private superpowers. And you think of the control of knowledge which they have in platforms that have transformed the way knowledge is created and disseminated, and their link to both to government, to Donald Trump and the Republican administration is a cause for concern. Partly because, as we saw when Elon Musk took over Twitter, there was a moment where people feared that that whole platform could be at risk. My colleague in Denmark, Nana Thulstrup, and I wrote in April an article about the deliberate destruction or deletion of knowledge on government websites. The Centre for Disease Control website had 108,000 pages of public health information removed earlier this year. But again, there is this human impulse to preserve, and a group of volunteer data scientists and digital humanists and librarians called the Data Rescue Project have been assiduously capturing those deleted websites, sometimes kind of furtively through the back door, working with federal government employees. So I'm going to finish now with my five reasons that I'd like you to take away as what I feel the value today of libraries and archives are. And the first of them is very obvious, a very obvious one. It's about education, and that's everything from educating children by giving them access to simple things to aid their early learning, right through to senior scholars. And again, this has been a long history behind this. You see this in Christian and Muslim manuscript illuminations. You can see in the Renaissance and the early modern period scholars like Leibniz, who himself was a librarian, theorizing about the value of libraries. And just like you are celebrating your 175th anniversary here in the university, in Britain we are celebrating this year the 175th anniversary of the Public Libraries Act, which enabled, and here's the text of the House of Commons debate, what they felt that public libraries were providing public improvement. And so this idea of public improvement, free to everyone, is a kind of an absolutely noble idea. Sylvia Pankhurst, there's this wonderful letter that she wrote to the British Museum, which then housed the British Library, asking for access to a reader's card so that she could learn about the history of the employment of women. And of course, we do this in various ways in our libraries, like you do here in the wonderful Fisher Library today. And I just like, there's one very important element of kind of public education that libraries often provide in a very sort of hidden way. And this is a scene from a film called Spotlight, which is a dramatization of the role of investigative journalists investigating sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in Boston. And they were able to reconstruct the activities of these paedophile priests by looking in out-of-date clerical directories and parish newspapers that were kept in the stacks of the Boston Public Library. Very boring books. Why would anyone keep these out-of-date books while they were absolutely vital for bringing those individuals to justice? My second value is diversity, bringing a diversity of knowledge, perhaps languages, of ideas, and this idea that you need to have both sides of the truth represented. A library, that's what libraries are able to do. And this is the Brooklyn Public Library, who's been digitizing some of those banned books in American states and making them available across those state boundaries. Libraries and archives preserve the rights of citizens. You only need to look at what happened in Germany in 1989 when ordinary citizens marched into the Stasi headquarters to stop Stasi officials from burning the files that then became a very important archive that was critical to the healing of the unified Germany. And librarians in an age of misinformation and disinformation are reference points for facts and truth. And you only need to look at the Partygate debacle in Britain that brought down the Johnson administration, or looking at activist archivists like the fact-based group that screenshotted every single Donald Trump tweet, including all the ones that he deleted or that his staff deleted. And Orwell knew what he was writing about. He was very, very prescient in 1984. And finally, identity. And again, libraries and archives help celebrate and preserve the identity of communities. And you can see that, again, by looking at Ukraine at the moment, just how much their identity in occupied Ukraine is being destroyed. And I'd like to finish with this kind of summary of why I feel society needs to take notice of the role that libraries and archives play on their behalf. And my kind of takeaway line for you is that libraries and archives are the infrastructure of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I heard a version of this yesterday and I could just listen to it a few more times, I think, for it all to sink in. Now, I know we've got lots of questions, but we've actually got to hand that privilege over and to ask Sophie G to do that job for us. So Sophie is going to be now having an in-conversation session with Richard on the stage behind me.
Hi, it's like being in a spaceship. Right. Richard, that was fantastic. That was absolutely wonderful. And this is a very undemocratic setup here because you and I will do the talking and everyone else will do the listening. So that's how it's going to work this evening. I'm waiting for the noise to stop. Knowing that we were going to be doing this conversation this evening, I was very struck when I was doing the tiniest little bit of my own work this afternoon, coming across a letter that the poet George Herbert, writing at the beginning of the 17th century, had sent when he was working at your rival institution, Cambridge University.
I'll spin out.
Yes, yeah, your satellite campus. And he was his official title at the time was the public orator. And he had to write a kind of thank you letter to the King, James I, because James I very generously had given a full set of his own books that he had written himself to Cambridge University and not Oxford. And Herbert's solution to this thank you letter was to say that James I's own writings given to Cambridge elevated Cambridge University libraries beyond the level of all the holdings in the Bodleian. So I don't know whether you would go along with that.
I'm not going to rise to
But that was the claim being made by the poet Herbert in the 17th century. So you've been around for a while. Richard, as I was listening to you speak so fascinatingly about the preservation of knowledge and the destruction of knowledge, it occurred to me actually to ask a very simple question, which is, what is it about the kind of knowledge that libraries hold that is so powerful? Why is knowledge power?
Knowledge is power because people can engage with it. It's not that if it existed and no one could access it, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that people can read. And it's reading, accessing that information that can both transform lives by giving inspiration and ideas to people, or it's facts. And those facts, I didn't have time to talk in depth about what happened in Bosnia in the 1990s. Again, this was not very long ago. Let's remind ourselves of that. But Serb militia targeted land registries because they wanted to eradicate any record of Muslims owning property. And that's about the reallocation of land ownership. So those kind of ideas and facts are what libraries do, and those are potent and powerful things.
Yes, it's incredibly interesting. And I sort of wanted to push on that a little bit because, again, as the sort of fascination that we have throughout history with what turns out actually to be the myth of the single destruction of Alexandria, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, that it actually wasn't a singular event. It didn't have this kind of performative element to it that we have in the paintings or the renderings of it, or that image of the burning of the libraries and the records in Washington, in the 18th century. I was sort of thinking about the ways in which, actually those institutions, those entities, weren't particularly accessible to ordinary people. So there's this strange kind of, it seems almost like a paradox that knowledge is that library knowledge is destroyed because it's associated with, kind of the people, and yet actually some of these very iconic libraries are very cloistered. They're very apart.
You're absolutely right. And I think sort of the history of libraries and archives has been one of sort of gradual expansion of access to them. The Library of Ashurbanipal was not a public library at all.
Yes.
It was kept in a temple. It was really a kind of private library for the king.
Yeah.
And his immediate entourage of followers and the royal family. But they still had that power because it was felt that the knowledge that those clay tablets contained could enable the king to change the course of history.
Yes. And of course, profoundly to impact the lives of real people living ordinary lives. I think it was the Library of Ashurbanipal contained a great many stolen texts, didn't it? Sequestered tablets from other city-states that had been taken.
We found this amazing correspondence where Ashurbanipal is kind of ordering his people to go and seize these, particular texts. He knows where they are. So there must have been a kind of sense of the holdings of different libraries, and certainly the kind of practice that, again, through patient study over the centuries since they were recovered, has shown that the kind of the behaviour, the organisation of those libraries was remarkably similar to the way, fundamentally we organise knowledge today.
So perhaps that there's a symbolic and often literal connection between the ways in which libraries hold, preserve, contain, organise knowledge, and the way they stand in for having this kind of authority and connection to ordinary people, even if ordinary people are not using the library.
Yes. Yeah. And I think if you take Bosnia in, the library in Sarajevo in 1992, that did both. The destruction of that did two things. Its symbolic act really was a terrible morale-reducing activity for the Serbs. There's a great Serb poet who wrote about black crows flying in the city, and these were the charred pages of books from the library. But it also, because it was the library which students in the university used, it weakened the ability for the young people of Bosnia to be educated.
Yes. Yes, it's extraordinary, that image of burning pages in the air. It always seems to be the trope that most strikes observers of damage to libraries. So I wanted to think together with you a little bit about this question of stolen knowledge and of erased or suppressed knowledge, because as Lisa said so well in her land acknowledgement at the beginning, we are on the site where a great deal of knowledge theft took place, and also we are on a site in which the history of making libraries and making European repositories of knowledge and the organisation of European and colonial information is itself, of course, always and continually erasing first knowledges, or has in the past been doing that. And, kind of intuitively, I suppose, the obvious libraries in our Western cultures erase knowledge as much as they preserve it. So I wondered if we could sort of think about that, perhaps, and think about sort of as a librarian, as someone who deals with special collections, to think a bit about what it means to be working with objects perhaps that aren't necessarily texts, but that are other kinds of records of knowledge that has been erased and suppressed, and is some of that sort of coming back into libraries now? So
I think there's certainly that's a very kind of broad question.
Sorry, can you talk about everything I just said?
Where libraries have been working with scholars and practitioners to identify endangered knowledge. And I think of the the ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax,
Yes.
who took a tape recorder into the southern states of the United States to record the music of black people in the rural communities and to document their musical practice and what they were writing songs about and their kind of musicality. And that is a kind of national archive, a national sound archive in the Library of Congress today. And it's kind of famously been now a source of remixing and reusing by artists like Moby and David Byrne and people like that. And so that kind of link between field work of ethnographers, anthropologists, to preserve oral tradition, whether it's spoken word, sung word, music, performed music, is something which libraries have become increasingly concerned about. They've also been mining their existing archives, to re-looking at them and reinterpreting them, because they often hold knowledge that was not recognised as being important or significant in the past.
Yes.
But with contemporary attitudes, we now know that we have huge responsibilities to work with communities of origin, where collections in our libraries, certainly the Bodleian is no stranger to this. Were the result of plunder from the colonial period, and our library was enriched by denuding communities of origin of their own knowledge. And so we have a responsibility today to make it available, encourage those communities to have access to it again through digitization, to make our collections as widely accessible as possible. But also to rethink how we describe it, and to use local knowledge traditions to describe it properly.
Yes. And to sort of rewrite so that there's one body of knowledge that we previously perhaps thought were in certain libraries and certain collections and certain archives, to discover that there is actually a different, a more challenging set of knowledges, perhaps.
There's a lovely story from the Bodleian about this. So the library was founded in 1602, or kind of refounded, and my predecessors sent an agent to the docks of Amsterdam to buy books that were coming off ships from the Dutch East India Company. And they bought a group of Chinese books in 1604, the first to enter any European library. But there was nobody who could read them.
Right.
For 80 years, until a Chinese man called Chen Fuzhong, who his parents were converted to Catholicism by Jesuit missionaries in China. They moved to Paris. He visited London. Thomas Hyde, the guy on the far-hand corner, heard about the Chinaman who had come to London, and he went to London and persuaded Shen to come and work for him in the Bodleian and paid him. And the first thing that Shen did was to turn the books up the right way on the shelf. But he catalogued them properly. He taught, there's fantastic notebooks where he's clearly trying to teach Thomas Hyde Chinese.
The detail about turning the books up the right way, that falls into the category, I think, of a fact too good to check. I don't know how they know that.
It's been written by scholars.
Okay,
by scholars.
I believe you then. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, and I'm mindful of us having about 5 minutes left, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about bad knowledge or incorrect knowledge. Because, of course, so much of what's in libraries is wrong. And it presents either a kind of very partial account, or voices have been suppressed, or it's just flat out wrong. And the older it is, the more wrong it is in a certain kind of a way. And then, of course, libraries are also preservers of bad knowledge, of wrongdoing, of harm, of violence, and so on. And so I'd love to hear a bit about your perspective on, I suppose, the value of preserving mistakes and bad knowledge.
So I think it's a great question. So there are three aspects to this. One is we've got to remember that librarians and archivists are human beings who live in a moment of human history in which they happen to be existent, and they make decisions about what to keep and what to destroy based on their own kind of world systems at the time. So they're fallible.
Yep.
They don't get it right all the time.
Yep.
And there have been moments where they got it wrong most of the time.
Yeah.
And so there are huge gaps which we now kind of complain about, both scholars and librarians. Secondly, I think that bad knowledge is still knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's a fact in kind of Wittgenstein's sense of, there is nothing in the world that isn't a fact.
Yes.
And the world only consists of facts.
Yes.
And the fact that somebody has made a proposition that is false, has tried to falsify a piece of information or to misinform, that is an important fact that needs to be preserved. And what it takes is the library's skill in metadata, in the provenance of information, in understanding where that has come from and who has made those interventions, but also to make sure that the knowledge that we are the custodians of does not get interfered with when we are its custodians. And so that kind of sense of trusted information and trusted record keeping is of absolutely critical concern, because we need, and this goes back to that point about WhatsApp.
Yeah.
And the politicians' use of encrypted and self-deleting technologies, where this is information about the formation of public policy. It needs to be in the public domain, even if it must be kept, closed for a period of time. At some point, it will enter the public domain, and the truth will be revealed. And I think that sense of libraries and archives being in it for the long game.
Yeah.
And we're so used to kind of instant gratification with information systems today.
Yeah.
We need to kind of recover this sense that actually there is a kind of slow learning has its own kind of
Yes. Yes. And I suppose allowing a record of human error to accumulate and remain and be visible, be returnable to, it's as important to organise and catalogue and understand our mistakes as it is to understand the things that we've got right.
So knowledge are, to me, they're like stepping stones across a lake.
Yes.
They give us surety about where we're going because we stand on firm ground.
Yeah.
We know what happened in the past.
Yeah.
And only through that can we properly know where we're going in the future.
I think we might have time for me to raise one related but final question with you, which is, I don't know how well I'm going to ask this question, so I'm hesitating to make it my last, but I'm going to give it a shot. Something I think that we're incredibly aware of at the moment is our ever-increasing need to be able to learn how to lose things, to tolerate loss. And there's so much, species, lifeways, foodways, cultures, languages, environments, there's so much. And, one of the paradoxes of libraries, I suppose, that really started coming up for me as I was reading your book and thinking about your talk, is that we think of libraries as preservers of knowledge, but they are also ways to allow us to think about how, as humans, we are continually losing the things that we value and the things that we think we know. Yeah. As someone who's spent their career, well, particularly with special collections, so I assume, older materials, but perhaps not, perhaps just special materials. Yeah. Okay. Is loss something that you feel yourself living with a great deal in your professional life, in your life with texts?
Yes, I do. And it's a great moment when something emerges out of somebody brings in a box somebody once brought it. We're lucky in the Bodleian to have the archive of the Shelley family, and somebody
With the manuscript of Frankenstein.
among
So amazing, yes.
somebody walked in off the street with Mary Shelley's travelling makeup box.
Wow. Wow.
And
That
presented it.
almost begs more questions than it answers, doesn't it?
Extraordinary thing. So, there are these
Amazing.
wonderful moments where things literally just walk in off the street.
Yes.
They're quite rare.
Yes.
But they're wonderful when they happen. Or when a scholar discovers something in our collections that we probably knew that we had, or is often has been described in a catalogue. Scholars tend to write that they discovered it.
Yeah.
An archivist or a librarian had got there before them, probably 30 years before them, but probably didn't fully appreciate the true significance of it. And the one recent example of this was the discovery by an American scholar of a group of printing plates that he recognised as being William Blake's.
Oh, wow.
And one of my team came to me very excitedly saying, Mark Crosby's found William Blake's printing plates. And there then was a dilemma because I said, well, we should make some new pulls from them. This would be fantastic. And he said, but we'd have to clean the ink out of the intaglio. And it was William Blake who last put it there.
Yeah.
We can't possibly do that.
What did you do? Not clean it?
We did it with one.
Okay. There's a whole, there's a conference, there's multiple books in that, and so we must finish. But I suppose that the very last thing I did want to mark again, particularly because I heard a version of this talk which was very great yesterday in front of the whole library staff, or a large group of the library staff at the library here, and it really struck me that there is so much intellectual courage in the history of librarians and archivists and the keepers of collections, and that it's a kind of courage that we do think about writerly courage a lot, but we don't so often, I think about the courage of archivists and preservers. And so I thought that would be a really great place to finish, just to acknowledge these millennia, generations and millennia of very brave people who've kind of stood up for documents.
And the many of them in America at the moment.
Yes.
So, there's
Yes.
one librarian I was speaking to a few weeks ago called Amanda Jones.
Yes.
Runs a small library in rural Louisiana, and is so determined to make the full range of texts available to her community that she now sleeps with a shotgun under her bed.
Yeah.
Because she's had so many death threats.
Yeah. So that, this is a real moment for courage, intellectual courage of all kinds, and it's really exemplary. Yeah. Thank you,
We've got
Richard.
many librarians from the Fisher Library here. Let me pay my tribute to them and to Ian.
Thank you, everyone. I think there's a little bit of housekeeping. Yes.
Thank you, everyone. So I've just got a few more thank yous. Thank you, Richard, for such a powerful and interesting lecture, and for Sophie for guiding us through a rich conversation. I think we will be inviting Sophie back to do a bit more of this. You've given us a lot to reflect on about the role of libraries in preserving knowledge, supporting truth and shaping the future. Thank you again to Dr. Steve Andersen and the Andersen family, whose very generous support made this visit possible. And a big thank you to the library events and communication staff and to our university operations colleagues who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this evening possible. And I also want to acknowledge Philip Kent, our outgoing university librarian, whose vision brought this all together. Richard and Sophie, we have a small gift for you as a token of our appreciation for your insights, your scholarship, and reminding us of the enduring importance of libraries in society.
I wonder what this is.
So finally, for all of you, thank you for joining us tonight. It's just one of the events that is part of the University's Library's 175th anniversary celebrations. So please visit our website or consider joining the Friends of the Library to keep connected with future events. Thank you once again. Have a wonderful evening.